With just a week to go until Election Day, the window to vote by mail may already be closed. The Postal Service says its on-time delivery rates are down to about 85%, far below the 95% standard and nearly as low as they were during the peak of the pandemic this summer. It's adding to concerns that mail ballots could be rejected in key battlegrounds if they arrive after the state's deadline. Instead, local officials and voting advocates are urging people to deliver ballots themselves, either to a local drop box or a county elections board. More than 69 million people have already cast ballots in the election. That's more than half the total 2016 turnout. The candidates are making their final pitches to voters. Take a look at their announced travel schedules. President Trump is campaigning in the battlegrounds of Michigan and Wisconsin Tuesday, as well as Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, worth an important electoral vote by itself. Then he's heading to the Arizona-Nevada border later this week. Former Vice President Biden is in Georgia, a state he hopes to flip, along with its 2 important Senate races. Then he'll be headed to the Midwest to try and secure his lead in states President Trump won in 2016. A lot has changed since the last election. The Midwest is facing some of the highest levels of coronavirus cases and hospitalizations in the country. At his Michigan rally Tuesday, the president complained about the availability of testing in the country.
And you know why we have so many cases? Because we test more. So we go around, and they're by the way, we're testing very young people, too. We're testing people in school. We're testing everybody. In many ways, I hate it. In many ways, I hate it. We test everybody. And because of that, now if I tested half, if I said, we are going to cut our testing down in half, they'd go crazy because the cases would go down in approximately half, right? But overall, it's good to have the testing. We find out where it is, and there are a lot of things. But they use it to make us look bad.
At an event in Georgia earlier, Joe Biden attacked President Trump and continued his pitch as the candidate to unite the country.
Time and again throughout our history, we've seen charlatans, the con men, the phony populists who sought to play on our fears, appeal to our worst appetites, and pick at the oldest scabs we have for their own political gain. They appear when the nation's been hit the hardest and we're at our most vulnerable, never to solve anything, but only to benefit themselves. I run to unite this nation and to heal this nation. I've said that from the beginning. It's badly necessary.
Caitlin Huey-Burns and Eugene Scott join me now. Caitlin is CBSN's political reporter. She's in Cary, North Carolina. And Eugene is a reporter at the Washington Post. Welcome to you both. All right, here we go. A week left. Caitlin, both campaigns are using some rarely seen assistance. First Lady Melania Trump spoke in Pennsylvania. Former President Barack Obama is in Florida. What can we take away from where the candidates are campaigning and using their resources in the final week of the race?
That's right. Well, where a candidate goes, the resources and surrogates they deploy, and how they campaign all sends a message in the final stretch of this campaign. The idea that the president is going to not only Michigan and Wisconsin, key states that helped deliver the presidency to him in 2016, but also going to Arizona, a deep red state, in the final days suggests that perhaps that state really could be in play for the Democrats. Meanwhile, you have Joe Biden going to places like Iowa, a Republican state now that went for Trump overwhelmingly in 2016. He's also in Georgia today, as you mentioned. This sends a message of where they think they could possibly expand their map. Now, look back to 2016 and remember Hillary Clinton was doing something similar, going to places like Arizona and other places to expand the map in the final stretch. Of course, we know how that ended up, and she was criticized for not going to the battlegrounds that really needed to see her, like in Wisconsin and other places around the Midwest. So there is a question of whether this is purely just messaging, whether it really does mean that this is where the campaigns think that they need to be and to go. But it certainly sends a message of where they hope this race looks in the final stretch.
Well, Eugene, these states like Georgia, Arizona, and Texas are typically Republican strongholds. No Democrat has won a presidential race in any this millennium. So what changed to make the Sun Belt in particular competitive?
Well, I think demographically, these states aren't what they were 10 years ago. They have younger populations, they have larger Latino populations, and even their Black American and LGBT populations and other groups that historically vote left are becoming more engaged and more vocal and more active. And so the left is hoping that that desire to see a change in Washington will lead to these groups actually showing up at the polls and bringing them a victory. What's also been the change in those states is that despite President Trump being as red as many of these states are in their legislatures and governors' mansions, he really has not delivered for them in ways that many of them would have hoped. The coronavirus pandemic has disproportionately affected seniors, a group that historically votes right, in ways that we haven't expected or seen before. And that's hurting Trump. And we're also seeing the right lose some success with groups like suburban women and even white working class voters, groups that historically vote right.
Well, Caitlin, let's talk about where you are right now. You're in North Carolina, where you've been speaking to voters outside polling places. And I want to play a clip from a first-time voter that you spoke to in Greensboro. Let's take a listen.
I'm actually 22. It's not the first time I can vote. It's just I felt like I needed to vote specifically this time.
Okay. So you didn't vote in 2016?
Nah, I didn't vote in 2016.
And why not?
Well, really, honestly, I just never really came. I didn't know the importance of it all the way. So, but now I know. And I didn't think my vote really mattered back then, honestly.
And you think it matters now?
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
So North Carolina's already passed 70% of its total 2016 turnout. What is driving the voters that you're speaking with to cast their ballots?
A key battleground state here in North Carolina. Mike Pence, the vice president, was in Greensboro earlier today as well. We were in Charlotte this morning, went to Greensboro, and now we're in Cary outside of Raleigh. And we have seen at these early voting locations that we have visited a steady stream of voters. And the consensus is from people supporting Biden and people supporting Trump that they wanted to get their ballot in. They wanted to get their vote in early. They wanted to make sure that it counted. And something that we have been hearing, and you saw that kind of reflected in that voter that I spoke to earlier, that first-time voter, that they really want to make sure that their vote counts, and that they've been hearing a lot on social media from their friends, from advertisements all around, the importance of voting itself. Some voters have told us they've never seen this kind of messaging specifically around voting. And so we're at an early voting location here in Cary. This is right outside of Raleigh. This is probably the longest line that we've seen inside. A week ago, they had about 17 ballot boxes. Over the past week, they've added 15 additional ballot boxes to be able to accommodate the number of people showing up early. And officials that we talked to here say that is something that's helping to alleviate some of these long lines. But the consensus that we've been hearing over and over is that people want to vote before Election Day to make sure their vote counts. And people have been really strategizing about this decision. There are apps all around counties here that you can check in and see what the wait times are in your area. You can vote early here in North Carolina until October 31st, and you just have to be in the county in which you live. You don't have to go to your normal precinct. So that's also important to know if you're planning to vote here. And if you're sending an absentee ballot in, make sure that it is postmarked by Election Day. And here in North Carolina, you have to have a witness signature to be able to complete your ballot.
It's so interesting to hear, Caitlin, the notion of having to add ballot boxes. It just underscores the intense interest there seems to be this year. So, Eugene, I also want to ask you about senior advisor to the president, Jared Kushner's comments on Fox News Monday about why the Republican Party continues to struggle with black voters. Now, first you will hear Kushner, then former President Obama in Florida this afternoon. Let's listen to that.
One thing we've seen in a lot of the black community, which is mostly Democrat, is that President Trump's policies are the policies that can help people break out of the problems that they're complaining about, but he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful.
His son-in-law says black folks have to want to be successful. That's the problem. Who are these folks? What history books do they read? Who do they talk to?
All right, so Eugene, you wrote about this in the Washington Post. Explain why this is getting so much attention.
Well, I think it's not necessarily shocking, but more offensive to many black Americans to be told or to imply that Donald Trump wants better for black Americans than black Americans themselves. Because the reality is that his track record just doesn't show that. Not only in the White House, but his history as a real estate developer has found himself involved in lawsuits with the federal government due to discrimination, and also him calling for the death penalty for black teenage boys who were wrongly convicted of a crime. And so that doesn't sound like someone who really cares about the well-being of black Americans. We know that black people are overwhelmingly backing Joe Biden in a CBS poll, as you just showed, of more than 90%. And so the reality is that Kushner seems not to be listening to the concerns of black voters and addressing those. Instead, he appears to be blaming them for not backing Trump, someone that most black voters believe is a racist based on his words and his policies.
Meantime, Eugene, last night we saw two major headlines out of the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett became the first Supreme Court justice in 151 years to be confirmed without a vote from the minority party. And shortly after, the Supreme Court declined to revive Wisconsin's extended mail ballot deadline. Now, first of all, on the confirmation vote, how significant is that lack of bipartisan support? And what concerns do Democrats have about how a sixth conservative justice might affect potential election legal battles?
Well, it's mainly significant because it just illustrates how divided we are right now in ways that we just never have been before, as the vote confirms. And it's also concerning because we know that with the conservatives having a majority to the degree that they do, that legislation and laws that Democrats have passed that they were hoping the Supreme Court would protect, it's possible that they may not. And that really concerns the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is moving further left than it ever has been historically. Regarding Wisconsin, this is one of the states that Donald Trump won in part because voters who were more likely to lean left did not show up in ways that, or amounts or numbers that they did, in 2008 and 2012. And that ruling could also lead to fewer liberal votes being counted in this election. And that's devastating to Democrats who were hoping that 2020 could be a reversal of 2016 when it comes to that state.
And Caitlin, we mentioned off the top the concern that it may be too late for voters to mail their ballots and be sure they are counted. You touched on this a moment ago, but what are you seeing from in-person voting there in North Carolina?
Well, this idea of making sure your ballot counts is something that we've been hearing over and over again here in North Carolina at various locations and also in other key states that we've been visiting and talking to voters. Florida, Georgia, most recent examples. I've been really struck by how closely voters are paying attention to all the mechanics of this process in a way that we just really haven't seen before. In many ways, the pandemic has emphasized the process of voting, put a bright light on the ballots themselves. And so that's a theme that we're seeing in this election, that the process of voting has become a campaign issue in and of itself. But another interesting thing that we're finding here in North Carolina is even though Democrats are encouraging their supporters to turn out early and the president is encouraging people to show up on Election Day and is focused on that Election Day vote, here, especially in Cary, we're finding supporters of both Biden and Trump all voting early. So there's a lot of rhetoric, of course, going on, but voters here are telling us that they want to be voting early to get their ballot in, make sure it counts, and also to avoid some of the long lines that they might expect on Election Day.
Really interesting. T-minus 7 days. I can't believe it. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Eugene Scott, thank you both very much. Really appreciate it. And a reminder, we'll have election coverage all day next Tuesday before shifting into high gear at 5 p.m. Eastern with a special election edition of Red and Blue.